Wendy Russman-Halpren will begin by giving a brief history of the congregation before the time periods that any of us were involved in it, before we were all born, in fact. Then I will talk about growing up in the congregation during the time that I lived in Iron Mountain, which was 1941 to 59. I was born in 41, graduated high school 59. Wendy will then talk about the time that she lived there, which was 1961 to 71. My brother Jack, had two stints in Iron Mountain, one when he was born there and growing up, and then he went back as an adult. And he will tell you about both of those time periods in his life. And then finally, Donna Minsky, who arrived in Iron Mountain in 1992 and essentially kept the congregation going until it finally ended officially in 2020. So that's what we plan to do. Get myself to the next slide. I want to point out there's a kind of a confound here. We're each talking about different time periods and we're all each different people. So I can't tell you that if I lived in one of the other time periods being covered, those experiences would have been mine or vice versa. But there are a lot of people who were associated with the congregation who've joined us, and we're excited to see that. And I'm hoping that they'll chime in and say in the discussion period at the end, yes, oh, that was my experience too, or no, you must have lived in a different world because I had this alternative experience. So that's the format that we're going to follow. And we would ask that you submit your questions via chat, and Kara will monitor them. And if something comes up that seems like people can't understand something we've said and it should be answered on the spot, then we'll try and do that. If not, we'll hold the questions until the end. And then I hope there'll be a wide open opportunity for people to join the discussion. And then finally, I want to point out that Kara is going to be recording this. And I know that it's our desire to use the recording for the museum in Iron Mountain, the local historical museum, which has many artifacts from the congregation, and it will join that and many of our records, and it'll join that material. So without further ado then, let me turn this over to Wendy Russman-Halpren to talk about the early history of the congregation from 1882 to the 1940s. Are you there, Wendy?
Okay, yep, okay, just unmuted myself.
Okay.
Okay, I am going to share the screen and wait a minute. Okay, did you approve me for sharing screen? It's not letting me share the screen.
Yes, you are a co-host.
Okay, wait a second. Let me get here. I opened it. Go to view. Go to view. Okay, I don't know why it's not. It worked when I tried this. There we go. Okay, wait a second. Okay, and first of all, for those of you who are not from Iron Mountain or the UP, I thought I would start off by showing you a picture of Michigan and where Iron Mountain is actually located. Can people hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep, okay. Iron Mountain's is on the western end of the Upper Peninsula, right on the Wisconsin border. We were much more oriented with Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota than we were with the Lower Peninsula. It's 4 hours by modern car now to get even to the bridge. And to give you some more background to try to figure out when later parts of the talk is that if you go south from Iron Mountain about 2 hours, you reach Green Bay. Another 2 hours south, you're in Milwaukee, and another 2 hours south, you're in Chicago, and that's with today's modern cars. So that will give you a little bit of an orientation of where we were. Okay. First of all, iron ore was first discovered in the Upper Peninsula in the 1840s, and that was the northern part, but it wasn't discovered in Iron Mountain area until 1878. By 1880, several mines were in operation. The immigrants were pouring in, Italian, Cornish, English, Finnish, Swedish, and they needed to buy things. By 1884, there were 8,000 residents in Iron Mountain, and there were basically very few stores that they could purchase things in. There were a lot of Jewish peddlers in Chicago and Milwaukee, very recent immigrants. And they had routes that they would travel up through Wisconsin, taking care of the farmers, and then to the Upper Peninsula, to the various mining communities. This meant very long times away from home, and it wasn't easy. I was able to interview the daughter of one of the earliest Jewish settlers who came with his family. And by the way, this information that I have is primarily from a paper that I did when I was in college, Modern Jewish History from 1880 to the present. And I did an oral history of the Iron Mountain Jewish community. So most of my information is anecdotal from people. So, take some of it with a grain of salt. Sam Rusky was a traveling peddler, and when he came back to Chicago, his wholesaler felt that there was a market for a established brick and mortar store, and he helped Sam get set up in a established store. Sam brought his family up to Iron Mountain, and he was one of the first Jewish settlers there. In 1894, he had a store, and interestingly enough, he called it the London store. As other peddlers came through the area, he would tell them how wonderful it was, all the opportunities, and try to convince other Jewish families to come and also settle there. He did a good job, and by 1890, there were 30 Jewish families. Almost all of them were storekeepers or wholesalers, or else they worked for other Jewish storekeepers. They tried to be very honest because they wanted to keep the Jewish image untarnished, and they were very well regarded by the townspeople. For example, one time there was a traveling Jewish peddler who was thrown into the county jail for illegal dealings. The Jewish community immediately posted bail, gave him a meal, put him on the next train out of town with instructions never to return. And they also told him to spread the word to other Jewish peddlers that this is the way they would be treated if they came and tried to cheat their customers. The community was observant. They all observed kashrut, the Jewish dietary laws. One man there actually acted as the shochet. They were Jewishly educated, so they could lead their own services. They didn't feel there was any need for a rabbi. They prayed out of a rented room above a store, for which they paid $10 a month rent. And the Torah, which they had brought up from Chicago, was kept in someone's home when it wasn't being used. On Shabbat, they would walk to services. They hired Shabbos goys to light their furnaces or their lights, or to do other things that they wouldn't do. And they wouldn't go shopping or conduct personal business. But there was a problem. They were storekeepers. And Friday night and Saturday were the biggest shopping days of the week. The miners got their paychecks on Fridays, and the farmers would come in on Saturday for their weekly shopping. Yes, they were observant, but they had to make a living. So they came up with a solution that was probably very common for Jewish merchants in small towns. They held their Friday night services after the stores had closed, and on Saturday, they held services before the stores opened. When they walked into their stores, it basically wasn't Shabbat. They would do everything that they normally did, handle money, conducted business. When they walked out of the stores at the end of the day, it was Shabbat again. Now, there is a saying that if you have 3 Jews, 2 will start their own synagogue, and the third one will refuse to join either. Iron Mountain was no exception. Around the turn of the century, a group of Jewish men decided they wanted more liberal services, and they started their own minyan. The breakaway group was led by Mr. Taylor, and this was told to me by Gertrude, I think, who was in her 80s at the time, and she just knew him as Mr. Taylor. She didn't know what his first name was. So this breakaway group, led by Mr. Taylor, went to the house where the Torah was being stored, and they demanded that it be handed over to them. Well, the person who was storing it refused. Supporters for both sides were summoned, and a verbal battle ensued. Mr. Taylor claimed that he worked for the sheriff's department and he had the authority to have anyone arrested who wouldn't give him the Torah. Now, these were all recent immigrants from Russia. And remembering the Russian justice system, or lack thereof, they didn't want to take any chances, so they handed the Torah over to Mr. Taylor. They then got together and bought another Torah and had it shipped up from Chicago. Eventually, the two minyans did reunite. The two Torahs reunited with each other, and those were the two Torahs that the Jewish community, and eventually Anshe Knesseth Israel, used. And those two Torahs were there just until last year when the synagogue was dissolved. Now, in doing some research, I was looking for some pictures of businesses owned by Jews, and I have, wait a second. Here's a picture of a store by Abe Sackham from the early 1900s. And this was one of the biggest stores. This was the biggest store in Iron Mountain, a department store. And you can see it was quite grand looking. And he stayed in Iron Mountain, I think, until his death in the 1950s or 60s, or maybe he moved, but he was there for a long time. So in doing research and looking for pictures of Jewish stores, I happened across a store owned by a Moses Taylor. He owned the Hub clothing store. Now, this story about working for the sheriff's department, I don't know if maybe he was a volunteer or if he made it up, but it worked. He got the Torah. He died in 1905. So this story had to have taken place in the late 1800s. In the early 1900s, the original Jewish families, many of them returned to the cities. They had made their money and they could now set up a business in the city, and they really preferred to be back where wait a second, let me go. Okay, they really preferred to be back where their relatives were, where their friends were. There was a better Jewish community. However, due to a series of pogroms in Russia, 1903 to 1905, there was a whole new wave of Jewish people coming over. And these new Jewish immigrants were very happy to replace the people who had left from Iron Mountain. One family, well known throughout the Upper Peninsula, was the Cohodases. Some were spelled C-O-H-O-D-A-S, and some spelled it with an E-S, but it was all the same clan. I think Max Cohodas had already settled in Iron Mountain, and as the relatives came, there were some in Marquette, and as the relatives came over, they convinced them to also come to the Upper Peninsula. So a large percentage of the Jews in the Upper Peninsula were Cohodases or somehow related to Cohodases. The new community of people were less observant and had less Jewish background. They decided that they wanted a building and a rabbi to lead services. In 1907, the Swedish Methodists, let me share this, the Swedish Methodists had outgrown their church up on, I think it was the east side of Iron Mountain, and they were going to have it torn down so that they could build a bigger building. The Jewish community bought the building and had it moved intact down to a lot that they had purchased on Kimberly Avenue. They then purchased the lot next door, which had a house, and that was going to be the house for the rabbi. This picture of the synagogue, Anshe Knesseth Israel, is what it looked like as I remember it. And there's also a side view, and you can see that it looks like it was expanded in the front, because there's 4 windows from the Swedish Methodist Church, but then there's an extra section from Anshe Knesseth Israel. There was an extensive remodeling that was done on the synagogue to make it useful for Jewish services. This section in the front was added, and there were two, when you went in the center front door, there were two sides. The men's side was on the left, the women's side was on the right. They each hung their coats in separate places, had chairs where they could sit separately. You can see the door was moved to the center and the windows were changed and the steeple was taken off. They decided that that looked a little too church-like. A women's balcony was added and stairs going up to the balcony. They put the bima in the center. That was the custom in Russia. They constructed a kitchen in the basement because what is Judaism without food? And of course, the kitchen was kosher. And they also built a mikvah in the basement for the use of the women. And there are stories that went around for how the Swedish construction people were marveling about the new Jewish church that had a swimming pool in the basement. And remember, this was a time when many people didn't even have indoor plumbing. Okay, this is the dedication plaque of the people, men, who were instrumental in organizing Anshe Knesseth Israel. September 22nd, 1908, my guess is that it was dedicated during the high holidays. And I also found a very interesting thing when I was searching through the pictures, trying to find pictures of Jewish stores, and that is that actually all of the Jewish stores from the late 1800s and very early 1900s were not owned by the people on this list. So I am not sure if this was the breakaway group or if this was new people who had just come in, but the people who had been there for a while, who had been there from the late 1880s and 1890s and were settled and had stores, were not one of them was part of the group that established this synagogue. I don't know why, but I thought that was a very interesting point. Okay, by the 1920s and 1930s, there was a full-time rabbi, and there was the high turnover. They didn't stay long. Iron Mountain was not a plum assignment, and they did not get the cream of the crop. The rabbi was expected to lead services. He was a shochet. He taught the children, in addition to performing weddings and funerals. The rabbis who they got were not particularly good scholars, and they did not have good pedagogical skills. As one of the people who I interviewed, and he was an older man, but remembered back to his childhood, said, the kids hated religious school and they tortured the rabbi, which could have contributed to why there was a big turnover of rabbis. Okay, let me just share one screen. Now, back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, probably into the 50s, it was expected that Jewish people would marry other Jewish people. But in the Upper Peninsula, you wouldn't marry someone from your own town. There were so few kids, they knew each other too well. So the problem was getting the kids to meet other Jewish kids. This was solved by having community picnics, and all kinds of Jews from all over the Upper Peninsula and northern Wisconsin would gather at these picnics, and everyone looked forward to them. The adults would catch up with each other, and the teenagers would flirt with each other. They would usually have a speaker. Often it was a Zionist speaker. Or in this case, this is a fundraising poster in Yiddish about donating money to help the poor immigrants. I found this up in the attic of the synagogue. And my daughter translated it for me. It's basically asking people to remember the poor immigrants and to help them so that they could also become established in the United States, and that this HIAS in really big letters in the middle was the organization that was going to do it. Everyone knew what the real reason was for these picnics, and the person who I was interviewing, who was a teenager at these picnics, said no one listened to the speaker ever. Everyone just basically was there to socialize. Okay, wait a minute. All right. During the Depression, into the 30s, it was very rough on the Jewish community. I mean, they were storekeepers. People did not have money, so they weren't buying things. And the synagogue did have problems. People were not making donations. Some people weren't paying their dues. Jim Zacks found a number of letters that were in storage where they were writing to people that you're in arrears, you need to pay a certain amount of money. And they actually set a payment for people wanting to attend the high holiday services in 1938, that if you were a member of the temple, you had to pay $5 per family. If you were not a member, you had to pay $10. And if you were a single person who wasn't a member, you only had to pay $5. But in 1938, there's a paper showing that the congregation took a loan from the commercial bank. And by 1940, there was a letter from the congregation to the rabbi saying they no longer had the money to pay for a rabbi. They said he could live in the house for 90 days while he looked for a new job, and they wished him the best of luck. And there was no full-time rabbi, as far as I know, after that 1940. By 1948, there were 20 Jewish families left in Iron Mountain, and most of these were the immigrant parents who had sort of come in the second wave. And many of them were now joined in business by their children. And their children were my parents' generation. And the last thing I wanted to say before I turn this over to Jim to talk about growing up in the 40s and 50s is in 1950, a VA hospital opened in Iron Mountain. And this did bring a few Jewish doctors to the community across time. And the VA hospital is still there and very, very active. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. That was fascinating. I learned much that I didn't know from before, even though we've talked a lot. So I was born in 1941 and stayed in Iron Mountain until 1959, came back summers of 60 and 61, and then basically have been going back as a frequent visitor because my parents lived up there until they passed away, and we still have a summer home right across the border into Wisconsin with my two brothers. So let me give you some context. As I said, each of us is telling our story as seen through our own eyes, so I'll tell you a little bit about my eyes. My father's family were immigrants. They immigrated to Iron Mountain from Lithuania, somewhere near Vilna, in the first decade of the 20th century. My father had 3 siblings. They were all born in Lithuania, but my father was born soon after they arrived in the US. My paternal grandmother was a Cahotis, one of the well-known names across the UP. And although I've never was told the story specifically, I assume that those connections were what made them know about the UP and had them end up there. My grandparents kept kosher. They were probably, as Wendy described, that whole generation largely did. And we had kosher dishes for them to eat at our house if they came to our house, although we did not keep kosher ourselves. And I have no memories about them being otherwise religious, other than the keeping kosher. I'm pretty sure that my grandfather worked on Saturdays and drove on Saturdays. So that was the religious context on that side. On my mother's family, my paternal grandfather immigrated from Russia, probably Ukraine, to Wisconsin initially, and then to Chicago, I believe. He married my grandmother, who was born in, excuse me, who was born in Chicago, I believe, and they immigrated back to Wisconsin, to Appleton, and then to Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and from there to Marinette, Wisconsin, where my mother was born and then raised. They seemed, if anything, even less religious than my grandparents on the other side. I don't believe they kept kosher. I think like all Jewish families in these small towns, they participated in the congregation, but my background in general basically was not a religious background, but they were families on both sides were participatory Jews. They were part of the Jewish life of the city such that it was. And it was the cultural background that was the tie to the other people. My own story, I was born in 1941 and I attended Iron Mountain schools until I graduated. I was an academic in my working life and eventually retired from a faculty position at Michigan State University. And in recent years, have been very much reconnected with the congregation because it kind of fell to me to dissolve the congregation and distribute all of its artifacts and assets. And that's a whole separate story altogether. So with that kind of a background, what I remember about Jewish life in Iron Mountain is that as a young child, I attended services, and I would describe them as Eastern European conservadox at that point. By that point in time, I believe that the women were sitting on the main floor. I sometimes think I have memories of the women going up to the balcony, but when I started looking at the data, I suspect that I never actually saw that, that ended before I was born, I believe. But the women were sitting on one side of the main floor, on the right-hand side facing the bima, and the men on the left. There was a central bima, as Wendy mentioned. The services were all in Hebrew, and I have in parentheses in my notes, incomprehensible. So as a young child, I had to sit quietly. I had the sense that there were a lot of old people. It was a place to be very respectful, but I don't have memories of a lot of understanding and deep involvement. I'm not sure how many of the second generation of people there, the people who were the adults when I was growing up, could read Hebrew fluently. It was probably a significant percent, but of those, how many could understand Hebrew as a language rather than transliteration? I'm not sure whether any could. I suspect that a few of the older people could, but most of the Hebrew was Hebrew that was being recited as something that you didn't understand, basically. My childhood experiences in the congregation, being in the synagogue, was a warm feeling. It felt like something special was going on, even when I was too young to understand what it was all about. We had high holiday services at that time, and for the whole duration of the time I was there. The rabbi was gone, and they were led by various visiting student rabbis. They tended to come for multiple years in succession, and so we kind of got to know them, and they were young, so they were approachable in general, and I remember that being kind of attractive. And the only other formal religious activities were yahrzeits, and that's the services. The other formal activity was Hebrew school. I think it was weekly. There was a small number of students because there weren't very many Jewish children in town, and they were spread across age groups. I only had one other person in my class in school, my cousin Peter, who was my age, and then there were some a little younger and some a little older. So it was from the perspective of teaching classes, it was a very difficult Hebrew school challenge to a teacher to engage all of these people at the same time. I don't remember Hebrew school focusing as much on Judaism as a religion as on cultural practices, holiday celebrations. That's partly the age. When we were young, that was what we could understand. And the one thing that I do remember, kind of a vivid memory, was going and learning that Israel had been formed. And there was an Israeli flag that they put in the basement where we had our classes, and they explained to us that Israel had been formed, and that was clearly special. Other signs of Jewishness in kind of everyday life growing up were Passover Seder, which we celebrated at home, usually with family. Blue box pushkis for coins for Israel, after Israel was formed. Don't remember how long, whether it was before or not. I had no direct experience, but I knew that my father belonged to B'nai B'rith and my mother belonged to Hadassah, and I knew those were Jewish organizations. I never quite understood what they were, but that was part of my experience of belonging to the congregation. And I remember, because it interested me a lot, occasional references to the Anti-Defamation League that I heard in adult conversations. And another fascinating kind of thing was itinerant rabbis, and I put rabbis in quotation marks. I'm not sure that they always were, but they would come to town. There was a circuit that they would make to collect money from various Jewish businesses around town. And because I worked in my father's business and hung out there at time before that, I would occasionally see these people come in, or I would hear my father having a conversation. The phone calls would go around, so-and-so's in town, be prepared. And after World War II, we had a refugee family, a cousin and her son, who came, and I don't know whether they lived with, my grandparents brought them over. I don't know whether they lived with my grandparents or separately. They stayed a couple of years, and then they immigrated to Israel. What I know about the congregants at that time was that the men were mostly businessmen or employees of Jewish businesses. And when I thought they were employees, they may have even had an ownership interest in them. So off the top of my head, I could think of two slaughterhouses, and they were, one was my father and uncle and grandfather, and they were the source of kosher meat in town for as long as there was a demand. There were two wholesale produce businesses. One was my family, a department store, a men's clothing store, a women's clothing store, a children's clothing store, a men's war surplus store that evolved into a men's dry goods store, and ultimately, after I left, a men's clothing store and women's clothing store, a grocery and dry goods store that evolved later into flooring, and I don't know what else. I think that one of the congregants had a Packard car dealership for a little while, and then he had a Sinclair gasoline distributorship. There was a junkyard, and there was a dentist. And the dentist was the only professional Jew in town until very near the end. Wendy mentioned that the VA hospital opened in 1950, and that brought in a string of Jewish doctors and a pharmacist you'll hear later on. And most of those were transient in the community in the sense of spending several years there and leaving, but it was a welcoming. The Jewish community became aware when they came to town, welcomed them, and many of them chose to become active participants in the congregation. And a number of the Jewish men served in World War II. The women I initially knew as mothers, just because I was young and didn't know about their other facets, but I came to realize later on that a number of them played a role in the family business. My early identity as being Jewish from all of this was that I realized I was Jewish. I wasn't religious. It wasn't, in fact, a kind of specially significant part of me. I mean, it was there, and the cultural part I was very aware of. But I didn't view it as part of my primary public identity. I think my parents and many of the people of their generation were assimilationists. Their goal was to blend in. Took me a long time to discover that my mother's family originated in Russia. I think she was nervous that if people knew we were from Russia, that would be a bad thing. I was bar mitzvahed. It was a special occasion. The entire family came. I was trained by a Hasidic rabbi from Marinette, Wisconsin. I learned to read and chant, but not understand Hebrew. I had weekly lessons, and I had a vinyl record of my Torah portion and other things that I had to learn that I practiced during the week. For me, the significant kind of thing that explains some things about me was the rabbi wrote my Dvar Torah. We never had a discussion about it was simply another thing I was to learn and say rather than think about, actively engage with. And I think that was kind of the tradition of that era in many of the small towns where there were not a lot of Jewish educational opportunities. In 1956, the building was remodeled, and sorry about that. And so this is what the inside of the synagogue looked like that Wendy showed you. After a remodeling in around 1956, my uncle Max and Esau Kahodis kind of took on separate jobs in that they were the planners and supervisors. And this is done by a Finnish carpenter. That is a Finnish carpenter from Finland, who was a very skilled man who remodeled it. And this is what the synagogue looked like really until the day that we closed our doors. The men sat over on the left side and the women sat over on the right until at some point I was told Dr. Al Miller went and sat with his wife on the right side. And I think that kind of opened the doors to a sort of integration of the seating for services. The building was modernized, the balcony was closed off, and we were on the first floor, and more English was introduced into the services. So by then it was more comprehensible. The congregation was shrinking. New bar mitzvahs were very much welcomed into the adult congregation because it had, at that time, had become very hard to have yard sites and to get a minyan for yard sites. And usually they would end up with 10, but somebody would be at least 10 or 15 minutes late and everybody would be waiting. So a new bar mitzvah who could make that not happen as often was very much welcomed on the scene. The congregation was shrinking also, as it had been for a bunch of years, as Wendy had pointed out. So in summary of and I say because different people I'm sure had different experiences even at this time, but that my whole relationship to the synagogue and in its role in my life was that it was not part of my primary identity, but I understood it was my cultural heritage. I didn't feel that it was publicly that people identified me primarily as being Jewish and then the guy who also skied and did a bunch of things. And it was understandable in part because you couldn't live primarily within the Jewish community because there wasn't a large enough Jewish community to live in, as there might have been in a bigger city where people had very different experiences. All of my contemporary friends, virtually all my contemporary friends then were not Jewish. I think that publicly, as near as I could judge, Jews were viewed as positive contributors to the community. So it was never something to be hidden. It just wasn't the salient part of life. And the final thing, many people, especially people from city backgrounds, ask me, what about anti-Semitism? wasn't that a terribly anti-Semitic place to be? And I have to say that I personally never experienced anti-Semitism overtly, and I may have just been oblivious, or maybe it was not a major thing. There were occasionally things that could be taken as anti-Semitic, but I took them more as just, so it, more than once somebody would say in conversation, talk about Jewing somebody down. And everybody knew what that meant. But I never had the sense they were saying that to me, as, you know, in case anybody doesn't know the expression, trying to get a lower price. And I'd never had the feeling that they were saying that to me and kind of saying, see, you're Jewish and you do that. It was just, that was part of the vernacular. And that was about the worst anti-Semitic thing that I experienced. So that's my experience. Enough from me. Let's turn on and go forward to my brother Jack. And Jack, are you going to share your screen? Are you there, Jack?
I don't have slides. No, I don't need to show
Oop, your volume is gone.
Can you hear me a little better right now?
No.
It was working before. Let's mute and unmute. There, can you hear me better now?
Just sit a little closer to your microphone.
I'm right on it. Can everybody
Turn your
hear me
computer
now?
volume up, please.
Does it help if I stop the share?
Try that. Okay, how about now?
Faint.
It was working perfect when we were setting up. I don't know what to do here.
Oh, you're coming in now, whatever you did.
Okay, good, good. I guess I'm going to start and go chronologically, starting with my experiences and feelings as a child. I think I'm going to talk about Sunday school in the basement. At that time, I'm guessing there were about 6 students about my age that attended Sunday school, plus a younger group. And the teachers were Mickey Miller, Eleanor Kushner, Betty Solem taught Hebrew, and my Aunt Betty Katz taught music. I don't think I left anybody out as far as the teachers. I remember that on Sundays we had Sunday school, we did history and other things. We did plays and had celebrations for the major holidays. But what I remember most is that I was probably a really horrible student and a real pain to the teachers, and I apologize if they're only alive today to hear it. I rebelled because I'd rather be doing other things. I'd rather be skiing. Sunday was where we had time trials for ski racing, and that may have shaped some of my feelings today. For my bar mitzvah, Betty Solem taught us how to read Hebrew and did a great job. And when I was 12, I started going to Green Bay every other weekend to prepare for my bar mitzvah with Rabbi Isaac Vanderwald. And like Jim, he prepared a vinyl record for me to use, and boy, that got used a lot to practice my Haftorah. And in fact, the record's downstairs. I was going to run down and grab it, but it's in a drawer downstairs. After the bar mitzvah, I would say that my main participation was being counted at minions and yard sites, switching off with my father for the Kohen Aliyah. You know, at that time, we were still conservative, maybe borderline Orthodox, and they followed the traditions in the Aliyahs. I went away to school in 1966 and I returned in 72, and my participation was much the same as after my bar mitzvah. In about 1975, Esau Kahotis was president, Beryl Kahotis was treasurer. When Esau passed away, Beryl moved up to president, and I got a phone call that I was made treasurer. Most of the business was handled between Beryl and myself as far as decisions that had to be made. But if I remember correctly, I think we had annual meetings, but not much transpired until we made the move to switch from conservative to reform. That was an interesting transition. We had, first thing to do was find a student rabbi that would come up and do high holidays. I think we started this in the spring. The reason we started it is we couldn't get enough men to have a minyan, so we needed to start counting women. And pretty much the consensus of the entire congregation is that we would switch to reform. The first student rabbi that we had up was Steve Leader, and some of you may have heard of Steve Leader. He writes a lot, he's published a lot of books. You see him on the Today Show in the morning sometimes. Steve is now the head rabbi at the Wilshire Boulevard Temple in LA. And the reason that we got Steve Leader as when he was a student rabbi was his father-in-law to be at that time was a physician at the VA some years back. And his name was David Goldsmith. And we had maintained a good, family relationship with the Goldsmiths through the years. And that's how I found Steve Leader to bring him up to make our transition. That went well, and that was about 1984, 85, I believe, when we transitioned to become a Reform temple. That meant getting new prayer books, but the thing I think I can mention most, or that I remember the most, was Steve really tried to make the transition easy. And the services he conducted that year leaned quite heavily towards conservative, so that all of us attending the services didn't see a huge change. There was probably some more English than normal, but all the pieces of the service were the same. I was treasurer until March of 1987 when I left Iron Mountain. Membership at that time was about 15 dues-paying families. There were some single people as well. Our income during that time was dues, and also we owned the house next door and had monthly rent from that house. So that helped keep the congregation on an even keel financially. During my tenure, I'm guessing in the early 80s, the house was sold on a land contract. We had a down payment, and that money went into a CD, and when I left in 87, that CD was still intact. Looking at my notes, it's a couple of interesting points as treasurer. I had to send out the bills for dues every year, and it was very interesting that most of the families' check was there in a day or two from the time they got the invoice. But like in any organization, there were a few that didn't pay as quickly, and it took a phone call or two. One of the things I was trying to remember in preparing my list of things to talk about is how much were the dues, and I really don't remember. But the best recollection I had was, I think a single person was $25, and maybe a family was $50 or $75. It wasn't very much money. Some of the other memories I have growing up and being in business in Iron Mountain for those years were the Lubavitch rabbis that would come through town, usually during Sukkah or Purim, with their mobile sukkahs, and they always seemed to appear at the warehouse when We were unloading trucks, getting orders ready, loading other trucks. The phone was ringing. Guys were asking me questions about what should I do on this order or that hour. Always seemed to be an inopportune time. And I had to sort of say, look, guys, this isn't the best time for me. The end chapter, I'm going to jump ahead, and I think that covers my memories of growing up. I didn't get into all the other parts of what it was like being a citizen in a very small Jewish community, because Jim covered it very well, and my memories are the same as his. But I'm just going to briefly touch on the end chapter, which Donna's going to talk about a little bit, but there's just to give some credit where credit is due. Rachel Solon was the final president, stepping up during the dissolution of the congregation, along with my brother Jim, Sandy Pelk, and myself. And Rachel and Jim did most of the work. I was there as labor to help carry things, and but they all deserve a lot of credit in the dissolution of the temple. And it was a difficult thing because every time I'd walk in there, it brought back a flood of memories, and those memories can't be repeated now because it's no longer a shul, and that's what we called it growing up. So that's my comments. Jim, unmute.
Yep. Thank you, Jack. So for the final chapter, and it's really the final chapter in multiple ways, Donna Minsky will talk about leading the congregation from when she arrived, her experience.
What about me? 60s.
Oh, sorry, Wendy, go ahead. Sorry, I skipped you.
Aha. Okay. I do not have any slides to show during this talk, but okay. My family was not one of the peddlers who came or set up a business or ran a business. We moved to Iron Mountain in 1961 from Miami, Florida. Talk about a change in climate. I was going into the 3rd grade. My father, who was a physician, who took a job at the VA hospital, which is the reason we went there. And, you know, why Iron Mountain, everybody always asked. And he grew up in Chicago and had very fond memories of going to summer camp in northern Wisconsin. In Miami, we were members of a large Reform temple. In Iron Mountain, when we arrived, there were 17 Jewish families. This counts widows as families. Many of the people there had taken over the running of their parents' businesses, and they were now, my parents' generation were now the people running the businesses that their parents had started. There were a few professional, few doctors, and there were about 8 children within a 6-year span of me on either side. There were never more than 5 Jewish children in high school during the 4 years that I was there, and this is a high school of 600. Religious services, as everyone has mentioned, were held only on the high holidays, and they would hire someone, and they always called the person the rabbi, but my memory was it wasn't always a rabbi. Sometimes it was the rabbinical student, sometimes it was just someone who knew how to daven. One year it was a kosher butcher. And my memory was also that they changed. It wasn't the same person for a long time. It was often someone different each year. There was an occasional Saturday morning bar mitzvah, boys only, maybe 6 during the 10 years that I lived there. I insisted that I was as good as any boy and insisted that I wanted to have a bat mitzvah. So I was the only girl, I think, in the history of the temple, and now that it's not there, ever will be, who did have a bat mitzvah. And as Jack said, that involved driving to Green Bay twice a month. That's a 2-hour drive in each direction, where we met with the Rabbi Vanderwald, who was the closest full-time rabbi to Iron Mountain. And the old Packer Stadium was on the road between Iron Mountain and Green Bay. So our schedule was set up specifically on when there were not home Packer games, because you couldn't get past the stadium to get to the shul. I also remember one time when I was there for a lesson. I think the Packers were in a playoff. The rabbi insisted that we had to end early and had the radio turned on so he could listen to the Packer game. There were also Yortzeit Minyanim, and the men would be called and said, so-and-so has a Yortzeit and such a time, be there. And it was just expected that you would be there. The Minyanim, as I got older, once again, you know, I was as good as any boy, although I wasn't counted. I would go sometimes to the Minyanim with the Yortzeit Minyanim with my father. And they were led by elderly Mr. Bellenkoff, who had an extremely strong Ashkenazi accent and mumbled. So I remember the services just being, and at a certain point, Mr. Bellenkoff would say to the person who was saying Kaddish, stand up. Person would stand up, he'd say Kaddish. He'd say, okay, you're done. That was the end of the service. So that's what the Yortzeit Minyans were like. We were a strong Jewish community, though. There were community meals. We had Simchat Torah, Hanukkah, and Purim, and there was a breakfast on Yom Kippur, community breakfast that only the adults attended. By the way, the kitchen in the 60s was still kosher. Each woman in the community was assigned to a holiday to prepare the meal, and my mother's holiday was Hanukkah. Religious school, I think, they attempted to have religious school a couple times. I don't have strong memories, but I remember it did not go well. I think the local women who volunteered to teach really meant well, but the kids did not take it seriously. They didn't have like real pedagogical, how is one teaching Jewish topics? And so I don't think that it lasted very long. The social groups, Women's Hadassah was very, very strong. Every single woman belonged. They were very active in the Milwaukee region, traveling to various conventions. They met regularly. They had fundraisers. By the time I was there, I think B'nai B'rith for the men had pretty much fizzled out, and they didn't do a whole lot. And there were no youth groups. My strongest memories were of the high holidays because those were the services that I went to. As a matter of fact, when I started going to college and went to Shabbat services, I was totally unfamiliar with them because I'd never been to a Friday night service in my life. And the only Saturday morning services I'd been to were the few bar mitzvahs. So it was a full traditional service. They used an Orthodox machzor, the Birnbaum machzor, although there was mixed seating, and people tended to sit in family groups. So, and since families were related to each other, there would be that one family group would be in this section, and one family group would be in that section, and we weren't part of a family, so we had to sort of figure out where we could sit that was not infringing on another family's space. The service was almost completely in Hebrew, although there were some English readings that were put in. And this was, the machzor we used was pretty old, so that the English was pretty archaic. Services started at 8:30 in the morning. They lasted until 1 or 1:30, and the men had to be there at 8:30 because you had to have a minyan. They also had to stay till the very end. And at a certain point in the services, I mean, they were long, and if men wanted to go out and take a break or needed to go use the bathroom, there had to be a head count to make sure that if this person left, there would be 10 men left. Women usually arrived around 10 and left around 12:30, 1 o'clock. Women and children, I should say. By the time we were there, very few of the congregants could read Hebrew or knew the prayers. There were some, but not many. It got boring really fast. The Por Hazan, or the leader, we called him the rabbi. The rabbi was up on the bima the entire time, davening completely by himself. I mean, one voice, that was it. He had to lead the entire service, read the Torah, blow the shofar, and give the sermon. And I remember a couple of times when, bless their hearts, they decided they would also give a children's program in the afternoon. I don't know what they were paid, but it probably was not enough. Services, because they were long and they were boring, and people didn't know what was going on, there were constant conversations going on. I remember one time someone brought a newspaper and literally sat there, opened it up, and read the newspaper in the middle of services. Kids were running in and out, mostly Jeff Kushner and my brother, constantly in and out. And if Rosh Hashanah happened, or Yom Kippur happened to be on a weekend, a Saturday or a Sunday, someone would always bring a transistor radio and go outside and listen to the Packer game or the local high school football game. And they would come in and give updates on the score. Everyone really appreciated these updates, I think, except for the person leading the service. I remember the president, who at that point was Isaac Ahotis, would stand up by the window and sort of keeping an eye on everybody. Every now and then he would rap on the window and say, "This is an important prayer, we're supposed to be quiet." So everyone would very respectfully stop talking and be quiet. But the prayer was in Hebrew, we had no idea when it ended. So after a while, people would just start talking again. And my strongest memory was when it came time for Chagbah, the lifting of the Torah. Remember, I said the Chazan, the leader, was a new person each year, so he didn't realize what was going to be happening. He'd call, he'd say, "Can I have someone to come up to lift the Torah?" Everyone in unison would say, "Barry Cahotis." Now, Barry was a tall, big guy, and he was strong. And unlike Moses Taylor, he really did work for the sheriff's department in Florence, Wisconsin. So he would go sauntering up to the bima, and remember, these were old Torahs. They were big and they were heavy. The rabbi would start explaining to Barry about how you take hold of the handles, and then you tilt it against the bima. You tilt it against the lectern to get some cantilevering so you could get it up. Before he even got past the first sentence, Barry would have grabbed the Torah and just held it over his head like a prize boxer winning the meet. And he would stand there holding this thing over his head and would turn around. Everybody in the congregation would be oohing and aahing, ooh, ah. And that was the high point of the service, pun intended. As far as Jewish identity goes, Iron Mountain was a very small town. Everybody knew who was Jewish. You could walk into a store and say, "Hi, I'm new in town. Can you direct me to a Jewish family?" No problem. You couldn't hide it. And I think this did produce a very strong Jewish identity in the people who lived there. I often heard a stereotype from other kids that all Jews were smart and had money. And this was just stated as an accepted fact. Pretty much at the demise of the religious school, Jewishly children sort of learned what their parents could teach them or whatever traditions were modeled in their home. And as stated before, the bar mitzvahs you had to go to Green Bay, and the rabbi, by the way, bar mitzvahs always were in June. Didn't matter when you were born, the bar mitzvah was in June, because that's when the rabbi was willing to travel up from Green Bay to Iron Mountain. As far as anti-Semitism went, there was some mild anti-Semitism, which was words and not physical, although I was told that boys got it worse than girls. I cannot count how many times I heard, "You're Jewish? I've never met anyone Jewish before. What do Jewish people believe?" Or, "Do Jews believe in God?" At Passover time, I'd bring matzah for lunch, and that always was a big conversation starter. And some kids truly believed that matzah was made with blood. It's just what they had heard. You know, it's made with blood, right? And this wasn't necessarily a bad thing because people ate blood sausage. I have been told by good friends more than once, "Wendy, you're a nice person, but you're going to go to hell because you don't believe in Jesus." Church is very important living in a small town. Everyone belonged to churches. You moved to town, the first thing you were asked is, "What church do you belong to?" We belong to the Jewish church. That's what it was referred to as, the Jewish church. And kids went to, at least my friends went to church every week. They belonged to youth groups. They went to retreats and summer camps. And I missed that. I missed that growing up, which is, I think, why when I went to college, I really sought out a Jewish community and tried to learn things, took a Hebrew class, took Jewish studies classes. I spent a year in Israel. Now, most of the kids, my generation, and I've expanded to maybe 10 years past me, was really the last generation of children to grow up in Iron Mountain. Some of you are on the call right now, and probably my description of the high holiday services bring back a lot of memories. Almost all of us live in large metropolitan areas or college towns. We didn't come back after college, nor did our parents expect us to. Most, as far as I know, still have a very strong Jewish identity, although a variety of practices. And we were all very sad to hear about the closing of the shul, but no one was surprised. We all expected it because, of course, we weren't going back. So those are my memories of growing up in the 60s and 70s.
Thank you very much, Wendy. I'm sorry
It's okay.
I got one slide ahead on my screen share. Last but not least, because Donna Minsky was leading the congregation from its dwindling time in 1922 until its death, and 1992, sorry. And so Donna, I will turn it to you to tell us of your experiences.
Okay, the way I came up here in 1992, my husband was working for the VA hospital. Excuse me. Here. I'm sorry. Okay, he was working for the VA hospital, and they asked him if he would like to come up to Iron Mountain. And he says, well, let me try it out. We'll see how it goes. So I says, okay, you can go up there for a year and see if you like it or not. And after a year, he says, I'm not coming back to Skokie, to Skokie, Illinois. And I sold my house when we decided it was time. And I moved up here, and my goodness gracious, it was culture shock for me. There was no Nordstrom's, no place to shop and things like that. And as for the Shul, let me think. There really weren't that many Jews up here. There were 4 Cahodases left. That was Lorraine and her husband, I can't think of his name, and Dora and Phil.
Beryl was her husband.
Beryl, thank you. And I think Beryl died very shortly after that. And it was wonderful going to the Shul. I mean, it's something I really didn't do in Chicago. We weren't religious at all. But came the holidays. We always had holiday up here. And let me think how it went. Oh, because there were no restaurants that made holiday dinners like they do in Skokie and in the Jewish areas in Chicago. I belonged to the Chippewa Club, so I would ask the chef if he would make a nice dinner for us. And I would give him the menu, and I would give him a Jewish cookbook so he would know how to cook everything. And he did a wonderful job. And those are the few things that I do remember. Dues, I upped it to $300 a year. And that was like pulling teeth, because some paid and some didn't pay. I'd send out notices after notice and didn't mean a thing. Nobody said, oh, I don't have the monies now. And that was it. That's all I could say on that one. And we remodeled the downstairs again, because what happened, water was seeping through the walls. So we took care of that. We had it waterproofed. And so we remodeled it with new cabinets, and what else did we do? or whatever. It was really nice. And we would have Shabbos services twice a month. And we would have a dinner down there, Shabbat, which was nice. Everybody brought a dish. So it was really, really nice. And I enjoyed that. And I don't know what else. I mean, there really isn't too much. I mean, I was only there 10 years, if that long. And Jim, you were saying your grandparents were from Vilna?
Yes.
Okay, that's where my grandparents were from, on my mother's side. It's a name I hadn't heard, you know, but maybe we're related.
We'll have to dig into that.
Yes, and but as for the shul, there's Sheldon and I in the end were the only two Jews there. So how can you have services and have enjoyment? And also we did not keep kosher at the shul anymore. And I don't know what else there is really. I mean, I've enjoyed living up here. My husband, Sheldon, loves it up here. But I don't know what else to tell you about the shul. Do you have any questions, anybody? On the end, well, that's about all I can say about it. I do miss the shul because we did do, you know, it was just the idea of going into the shul for holidays and having services. And we had one ex-member, he did the services every, you know, the Friday nights, and he did the holidays, and it was nice. And this is how the Jews got together here in Iron Mountain, by having dinners and et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know what else to tell you guys.
The question was asked of how many Jews are left in the community.
You're talking to her.
And her husband.
And my husband, my spouse, yes. And he's retired from the VA hospital here. And there are a few other Jews, but they won't come out and say it. And they never participated. So we just left them be. But as far as I know, my husband and I, we are the only two Jews in Iron Mountain. In fact, a couple of years ago, I had surgery. And after the surgery, I went to a Mary Hill nursing home. And I don't know what the gal was.
The interviewer.
Oh, the interviewer, she came into my room. Sheldon was sitting there with me. And she says, "What is your religion?" And I hemmed and hawed, and I says, "We're Jewish." She didn't know what to say. She had never, I don't think she ever met a Jewish person before. And it was just funny. And that was my only encounter with, about Judy, you know, about being a Jew. And that's all that I can think of. Yeah, any other questions?
There was a question as to whether there were still any children in the synagogue.
No, we were all old people. It's all you know, oh yes, Sandy Pelk. She had her she had three or four boys, I don't remember. And they, once on occasion, they would come to services, but her two youngest boys were bar mitzvahed at the shul, which was nice. I mean, it was exciting. That was the last two bar mitzvahs that the shul had. In fact, the one boy,
He's a fighter pilot.
he's a fighter pilot. He flies the jets around.
And the other one is intelligence.
Oh, and the other boy is in
Military.
military intelligence communication. So those were the only two children that were in Shul. And I really enjoyed participating. Oh, and I was the treasurer. And my book's always balanced. They don't at home, but at the Shul they balanced. But so that was nice. And oh, my husband says, that's all, folks.
There's a question of how did you close the shul and what happened with the items there, like the Torahs?
I can take that one.
Yes,
Um,
please do.
But I'd interject. Rachel Solom was also and is still in Iron Mountain and was also in active in the congregation. We had some financial obligations. There was some money loaned to us by one of the former congregants as it was being winded down. And so we felt an obligation to repay that. And so rather than donating the Torahs, which would have been our first instinct, we felt obliged to sell them, and we sold them to a Torah scribe in Skokie, Illinois. One of them has since been sold by him to a congregation in Joliet, Illinois. And that congregation, we contacted them to see if they'd like anything else from the synagogue. And on January 3rd this year, I drove with a minivan full of two chairs for their bima and two large menorah, floor menorah lamps, and a number of other items from our synagogue that went into their kind of auxiliary chapel. And I got to see their final home, and I have had pictures of them since. And it's really delightful to see a small part of the synagogue reconstructed there. We reached out to anybody who had, any descendant of anybody who was on the yahrzeit board to see if they would like the yahrzeit plaque for their family member. And we've distributed roughly 60 out of 67 of those. And if there's anybody attending here who thinks there's one for their family, please get in touch. So we reached out to other congregations. The yahrzeit board minus the plaques went to the congregation in Marquette. Two chairs from the bima went to the Chabad synagogue in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And there are still a few items, I think, in my basement at our cottage waiting for new homes, but virtually everything went. There was a breastplate and crown for the Torah that we also determined had significant value, so it couldn't be given away, but we were delighted that I believe, grandson of the people who donated it and in whose memory there was an inscription on them, wanted it and purchased it from the congregation. The building itself was sold I think we closed in about February of this year. And the building has gone from being a church to a synagogue to a home for 12-step programs in Iron Mountain. So there is a nonprofit group that runs about a dozen meetings a week, various 12-step programs. And that's what's going on there now. And we're delighted because we feel like it really serves the community. Are there
any more questions? If so, please feel free to submit them to me via the chat feature, and then I will read them out for them to be answered.
I wanted to just, I wanted to add one thing about the history of the congregation, if that's okay. And that is that in the research I did, it appears that virtually all of the people who came and settled in Iron Mountain were Lithuanian. It was a huge Lithuanian congregation. A lot of the prayer books that were found up, that were upstairs in the attic, the Geniza, so be it, were from Lithuania. So I think it was that the people who started were from Lithuania, and so they got landsmen to come and join them.
We did have a couple other questions come through. One of them was, are there any functioning congregations up in the UP right now? And we actually just had a program a few weeks ago on that. There are a number of functioning congregations throughout the UP at this time.
Is a tape of that available if anybody else is interested in seeing it? It was a very interesting session.
There is a link to that available, and I apologize, my dog is getting a little antsy. There is a link to that available, and the question was just asked, what is the shul used for now?
As I said, it's being used, it houses a nonprofit organization who runs 12-step programs for people with alcoholism, et cetera, et cetera. There are 12-step programs for many different things. And they run, I think, 12 to 14 sessions a week. And we're delighted that it's serving the community, and the building is serving the community in that way.
I wanted to comment that Rabbi Yehuda Leib Posner, who was my visiting child rabbi, is still alive in Brooklyn and has many stories to tell about the mikvah in the synagogue and many stories about the Solom family with whom he had greatest contact. He's in his late 90s. His wife, Thirza, died about 2 years ago.
Thank you. Thank you for letting us all know that. Thank you to all of our presenters today. This was really, really a very interesting presentation. And if anyone who couldn't be here today but is interested, there is a recording available. You will all be sent the link within the next couple of days. And we hope to see you all very soon at one of our upcoming programs. As we said before, we have our program September 30th, Jerusalem of Gold or Iron. We have another program with Dr. Jonathan Sarna on October 13th and October 27th for the Beth Bible Garden Tour. And Jim, did you have something else to add?
I just wanted to say thank you very much to the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan for giving us an opportunity to tell our story. As you can tell, this was a big part of our lives, and it's really fun to have an opportunity to tell it. And thank you to everybody who came to listen. We really appreciate that.
It was our pleasure to do this, and we are really excited to share the history, the Jewish history of all of the state of Michigan with our members and with our friends. So if anybody has any program suggestions about areas throughout the state where we might want to learn more about Michigan Judaism and the history of Michigan Jews in your area, please feel free to reach out to us. Thanks, everyone.
Can we leave the Zoom open? I'll host it since I'm still a co-host. For those from Iron Mountain or anyone else who want to just sit and kibitz for a little bit?
Yes, I'd be happy to leave it open for you guys.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.